At the Foro Italico in Rome, Italy, the main show courts seat thousands of people. For a reigning Grand Slam champion, a top 3 player in the world like Aryna Sabalenka, you could literally count the empty seats. You could hear a pin drop in a stadium built for roaring crowds. But just a short walk away, on a small outside court, for a qualifier named Alex Ella, you couldn't even find a place to stand. I have watched tennis for a while now, and this whole situation, man, it has been eating at me. The coverage missed this entirely. Every channel, every tennis broadcast, is talking about the ticket prices in Italy or the weather or the time of day. The popular understanding is that the Rome organizers are just dealing with a bad marketing year. Or perhaps the local fans in Italy simply do not care about early round women's tennis matches. But that is not bad marketing. That is a broken metric. Because nobody is talking about what this contrast actually means for the future of the sport. Let me break this down. Because to understand the sheer absurdity of this contrast, you have to rewind and look at the physical environment of the tournament. The Italian Open is not a small, forgotten event on the calendar. It is a Masters 1000 tournament. It is one of the most prestigious and heavily funded stops on the European clay court swing. Historically, the crowd in Rome is deeply passionate, loud, and physically present. When a top-tier player steps onto the main stadium dirt, the expectation is a large audience. Aryna Sabalenka is exactly that kind of player. She possesses the heavy baseline power, the Grand Slam titles, and the elite ranking that the Women's Tennis Association, the WTA, tells us is the ultimate draw. She is the premium product the tennis system is designed to sell and promote. Yet, the visual evidence from Rome was striking and undeniable. Wide, sweeping camera angles from the official broadcast showed rows upon rows of unoccupied blue plastic chairs. The atmosphere was sterile, almost hauntingly quiet for a player of her magnitude. It looked like a closed practice session rather than a premier main draw match at a Masters 1000 event. Now, look at what was happening simultaneously just a few courts away. On an outside court, a space typically reserved for the fringes of the tournament, there was a completely different reality. Alex Ella, a young qualifier from the Philippines, was stepping onto the clay. The bleachers were not just full, they were overflowing. Fans were crammed against the wire fences, leaning over the rails, creating a dense wall of noise and physical presence. There were 0 tickets left. There was absolutely 0 breathing room. The tournament security had to monitor the crowd density because it was pushing the physical limits of the small venue. Here is where the data makes this contrast so jarring. At the time of this event in Rome, Aryna Sabalenka was sitting comfortably inside the top 3 of the world rankings, holding thousands of ranking points, with multiple high-level titles. Alex Ella was grinding through the qualification rounds, ranked well outside the top 150 globally, fighting just to earn a spot in the main draw. On paper, the gap between them is an absolute mathematical chasm. In the strict logic of professional tennis, one player is a top seed, and the other is a statistical underdog. If you only look at the numbers, the empty stadium for the champion and the overflowing court for the qualifier makes absolutely no sense. But here is the thing. The fans in Rome were not looking at the numbers. They were operating on a completely different frequency. The tournament organizers built their schedule and assigned their courts using one specific, traditional measurement. But the crowd on the ground proved that the system is currently counting the wrong things. To understand why an unseeded qualifier from the Philippines can draw the largest crowd of an entire Masters 1000 event in Italy, while a Grand Slam champion plays to the umpire and the ball kids, we have to look closely at the exact metric the sport of tennis uses to measure a player's worth. Look closely at Aryna Sabalenka's resume. She is a reigning Grand Slam champion. She possesses one of the most devastatingly powerful baseline games in the modern era of the WTA. When the governing bodies of tennis construct their global marketing strategies, they are building them around athletes exactly like her. She has the ranking points. She has the major hardware. She has the explosive athletic profile that the sport has spent decades telling us is the absolute pinnacle of sports entertainment. And yet, when she walked onto that premier stadium clay at the Italian Open, the fundamental mathematics of tennis failed her. If the established logic holds true, if ranking points directly and consistently correlate to crowd interest, then a top 3 player should automatically generate a massive audience in a major European capital. But the seats were blue, empty, and largely silent. Now, The instinctive reaction from casual observers is to blame the organizers. You hear arguments about poor ticket pricing, inconvenient scheduling, or a general lack of local interest in the early rounds of the tournament. But let me be clear. That is not bad marketing from the Rome tournament directors. That is a broken metric. For generations, the governing bodies of professional tennis have operated on a very specific, deeply ingrained economic assumption. They have treated WTA and ATP ranking points as the absolute, unquestionable currency of the sport. The entire ecosystem of a tournament, from court assignments to primetime television slots to promotional budgets, is dictated by this single number positioned next to a player's name on a spreadsheet. The assumption is entirely linear. If a player accumulates more points and wins more prestigious tournaments, they will inevitably become the primary draw for paying customers. It is a system built on pure athletic meritocracy. I want to be honest about the limits of this argument. There is a completely valid version of this story, where logistical necessity dictates these scheduling decisions. A Masters 1000 tournament is a massive, complex operation. The broadcast networks, the premium sponsors, and the VIP ticket holders all pay for the guarantee of seeing top-seeded players on the main television courts. You cannot easily take a top 3 player in the world and banish them to an outside court just because the advanced ticket sales look soft. The organizational hierarchy of tennis demands that the highest-ranked players receive the premium real estate. But adhering strictly to that hierarchy is exactly what exposes the flaw. The vacant chairs surrounding Sabalenka's match are the undeniable visual proof that this traditional currency is losing its exchange rate. The organizers in Rome did exactly what the system trained them to do. They took their highest-ranked available asset and placed her on their largest, most expensive stage. They were counting ranking points, assuming the fans would obediently follow the math. But the crowd did not follow the math. It is crucial to understand that this is not an indictment of Arena Sabalenka. She is doing exactly what she is supposed to do. She is winning matches at the highest possible professional level. The failure here belongs entirely to the measurement system itself. The sport assumes that athletic excellence is the only metric fans are willing to pay for. They believe that a high ranking is the ultimate magnet for human attention. But when a Masters 1000 event cannot fill its main show court for a reigning Grand Slam champion, you have to stop asking what is wrong with the promotional posters. You have to start asking what the system is failing to measure. Because while the tournament directors were busy counting ranking points on the main stadium, the actual fans were dealing in a completely different currency, just a short walk away, 2 courts away from the silence of the main stadium. An entirely different physical environment was unfolding. Alex Ila, a young qualifier representing the Philippines, was scheduled to play on a peripheral outside court. If you look at the raw footage from the grounds of the Italian Open, the visual contrast is staggering. There were 0 empty chairs. There was no standing room left. Spectators were crammed shoulder to shoulder against the outer fences, leaning over the temporary barricades, creating a dense, vocal wall of human presence. If you analyze this scenario strictly through the traditional logic of professional tennis, it makes absolutely no sense. A player ranked well outside the top 150 inches the world does not organically generate a capacity crowd in the preliminary rounds of a major European clay court tournament. The established math simply does not support it. But here is the secret revelation that the traditional coverage missed entirely. To understand the explosive attendance around Alex Ila, you have to stop looking at the WTA rankings and start looking at the actual census data. Italy is home to one of the largest overseas Filipino populations in all of Europe. There are hundreds of thousands of Filipino citizens living, working, and establishing communities across the country, particularly in major urban centers like Rome. When you understand that specific demographic reality, the crowded outside court instantly makes sense. The people packed against the chain-link fences were not there to watch a standard tennis qualification match. They did not buy a ticket because they were deeply invested in the technical mechanics of the sport or because they were tracking Alex Ila's specific WTA points. They were there entirely because of the flag printed next to her name on the scoreboard. That is not a traditional sporting audience. That is a diaspora. For the Filipino community residing in Italy, the presence of Alex Ila at the Foro Italico was not just another match on the schedule. She ceases to be just an unseeded qualifier in that specific context. She becomes a direct, localized representative of their national identity on a premium European stage. Buying a ground pass to stand outside her court was not an act of tennis fandom. It was an act of cultural solidarity. This right here exposes the massive structural blind spot of the tournament organizers. The planners in Rome looked at a sterile spreadsheet to determine their daily schedule. They saw a low-ranked player from Southeast Asia and assigned her to a small, secondary court, functioning under the strict assumption that low ranking points equal low public interest. They mapped out the grounds based strictly on the athletic hierarchy, but they were completely blind to the actual demographic reality of the very city they were operating in. The system failed to anticipate the crowd because the system is using the wrong measurement. The tournament directors were strictly counting ranking points to assign value, but the thousands of fans surrounding that court were dealing in a completely different currency. Identity. Ranking points are inherently unstable. They drop when an athlete sustains an injury, and they disappear if a player fails to defend a title. But identity does not depreciate. The emotional connection a fan feels toward an athlete who represents their home country, especially when viewing them on foreign soil, is permanent and unconditional. Professional tennis has spent decades trying to sell the global audience on the sterile, mathematical perfection of top-tier seeds playing in massive arenas. But the physical reality on the ground in Rome provided a glaring counter-argument. Raw, localized human connection will aggressively outdraw abstract statistical perfection. The physical reality of the overcrowding around Alex Ila's court was obvious to anyone with a pair of eyes on the ground at the Foro Italico. Security personnel were visibly having to manage the sheer density of the crowd. Yet, the official response from the Italian Open tournament directors, the structural reaction from the system itself to this massive influx of human interest was absolute, unyielding silence. They did not move the match. They did not suddenly upgrade Ayala to a larger stadium to accommodate the thousands of Filipino fans flooding the pathways. They held the line and stuck entirely to the printed schedule. Now, I want to be honest about the limits of this argument. The generous reading here is pure, rigid logistical necessity. You simply cannot run a Global Masters 1000 event strictly on sudden spikes in crowd emotion. The Italian Open has complex broadcast contracts with international television networks. They have premium sponsors who paid exorbitant sums for luxury suites specifically to watch top-tier, globally recognized players like Sabalenka on the center clay. You cannot arbitrarily evict a reigning Grand Slam champion and a top 3 player in the world from a main show court just because an unseeded qualifier has a louder, more concentrated demographic presence on that specific afternoon. You have to respect the athletic hierarchy. If professional tennis abandons its meritocratic ranking structure entirely, the sport loses its competitive integrity. Both things might be true at once. The sport absolutely requires a strict, point-based ranking system to function as a legitimate athletic competition, but the business of the sport desperately needs the raw, ticket-buying enthusiasm of those fans pressed against the outer fences. The problem arrives when the governing bodies of tennis refuse to acknowledge the growing friction between these two realities. The silence of the organizers in Rome and their strict, unbending adherence to the original court assignments exposes a massive systemic lag. By stubbornly clinging to WTA ranking points as the single, undisputed metric of a player's worth, the tennis establishment is actively stifling the commercial potential of emerging, non-traditional tennis markets. This is not just about one match in Italy. This is about the structural ceiling placed over athletes from developing tennis nations. Alex Ayala is not just a tennis player attempting to climb the rankings. For the Filipino diaspora, she is a cultural focal point. But the traditional tennis system does not have a column on its spreadsheet for cultural focal points. It only has a column for points earned at lower-level challenger tournaments. Because of this rigidity, the sport is actively ignoring a massive source of energy. They are treating the explosive crowd support for Ayala as a quaint scheduling anomaly rather than a blueprint for global expansion. The organizers looked at a packed outside court and an empty main stadium, and instead of questioning their outdated measurement, they simply let the tournament proceed as if nothing unusual was happening. They allowed the traditional metric to suffocate the actual, organic growth of the sport right in front of them. My prediction is this, and I am going to commit to it. Within the next 5 years, the governing bodies of professional tennis are going to have to fundamentally restructure how they assign value to their players. They will have to start factoring in real-world demographic data, not just sterile WTA ranking points, when they build their daily schedules. If they refuse, if they keep stubbornly holding onto an outdated metric, they will continue bleeding money on empty center courts, while their outside courts literally become physical safety hazards. The sport is currently sitting on a massive goldmine of global, grassroots passion, but it is trying to mine it with the wrong tools. The next era of tennis isn't just going to be defined by who has the heaviest forehand, the most titles, or the highest concentration of ranking points. It is going to be defined by which players can genuinely mobilize entire communities. Alex Iala proved that the organic demand is already there. Now, we wait to see if the system is finally willing to supply the proper stage. And honestly, as a fan of the game, this whole situation leaves you with a deeply complicated feeling. On one hand, watching that footage of Iala, seeing thousands of fans lifting up their own representative on foreign clay, it is genuinely beautiful. That is the raw, beating heart of why we watch sports. But on the other hand, it is incredibly frustrating to watch a billion-dollar industry fail to recognize the massive currency of identity staring them right in the face. This story has barely begun. Tell me in the comments what you actually think. Should Masters 1000 tournaments finally break tradition and instantly upgrade court assignments strictly based on localized crowd demand? Or must those premium show courts always remain mathematically reserved for the highest-ranked players, even if they end up playing to completely empty seats? Come back to this video when the Asian hardcourt swing begins later this year, because everything we have discussed today about market metrics and cultural identity will either look prescient or look like overcautious noise. If this kind of analysis is what you come here for, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The most interesting takes always end up at the top, so get in there. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.